Welcome to COVID and Climate Change Correlations, a weekly video podcast where I, Daniel Sanderson, engage in a stimulating conversation with post-Keynesian economist Steve Keen. Okay, welcome. We've got another episode here with Steve Keen, my favorite economist. And, I have to say, I'd like to spend a little bit of the first part of this episode talking to Steve about political systems. And I'd like to zero in on some political parties. I'd like to have Steve talk a little bit about what he thinks about traditional conservative versus liberal parties, and then apply that to which party fundamentally. We're talking big, broad brushstrokes here, but I think there's a fundamental tradition between liberals and conservatives around the world. Which of those two parties do you think ultimately would be in a better position to adopt a change in economic reality?
Yeah, well, I might frame this by talking about a good friend of mine who's an arch conservative, who's Vox Day, who runs Castelia House. And I've agreed with Vox to publish my next edition of Debunking Economics through Castelia House. Now, Vox is somebody who's he's Christian by religion. I'm agnostic. He is opposed to migration en masse because he wants to hang on to the integrity of a particular nation, maintain its culture, a whole range of things that I have different positions on. And we get on extremely well because what we're interested in doing is talking about the world, how the world actually works versus how various political extremes think it works. And on that front, he finds my economic analysis the most realistic he's found. And we agree completely on the economic side of things, and we could agree on climate change. I haven't actually discussed that with him, but he happily includes material of mine critiquing the so-called conservative view of climate change, et cetera, et cetera. So what we find ourselves debating as sort of progressive versus conservative is a bit like, astronomers at the time of Copernicus and debating whether the Earth is the center of the universe or the sun is the center of the solar system. Guys, it's the solar system. It's the sun. Shut up with this Earth-centric nonsense, et cetera, et cetera. So I think what's actually happened, unfortunately, is because we've ended up politicizing scientific and economic analysis. What our modern day conservatives and progressives fight over is issues that are going to be resolved factually one way or the other at some point. And that's nonsense. What we should be debating is the sort of stuff that Vox and I differ over. And I can respect his position on that front because, it comes down to cultural desires, personal opinions, et cetera, which is the sort of thing we should be debating at politics. We shouldn't be debating whether the government should run a deficit or not. It should run a deficit unless you want to have no money in your economy or no money that isn't attached to debt, et cetera, et cetera. We shouldn't be debating climate change. We have to keep the global temperature within the bands of the Holocene or we won't have human civilization, et cetera, et cetera. So that's my current reason for being extremely frustrated with both extremes of politics today. But having said all of that, the parties that are closer to having some sense of realism on that front are the ones that call themselves progressive. The Democrats in America, the Labor Party, what's left of it in the UK and Australia. So they are better equipped, but by no means are they ready to handle what we face.
Yeah, that is a very, very good explanation, and I'm probably because I agree with it so much. I did. I had the pleasure of looking at some of Vox Day's information. I think definitely my tendencies as an adult, as a middle-aged man, are a little bit more on the liberal side of things, but there's some lunacy there. there's some lunacy on the conservative side, and I think you've really properly captured it. That Vox appears to me, and I've got a limited exposure to him as well, or I have a limited exposure to Vox, but he seems progressively conservative, right?
Yeah,
and so he's open to rational thought, dialogue, and pretty much against nonsense, right? Which is very interesting. And there was an analogy I heard recently on an interview with Russell Brand and Ben Shapiro. And this is where Ben Shapiro said something about the definition of conservatism. And he said, it's like, imagine walking in a field and you came up to a small pony wall in the middle of the field. And the heuristic that you want to use for a conservative is that they're actually going to look at that wall, the little stub wall, and say, I wonder why I was here. What should we do about it? Maybe it was here for a reason, kind of thing. And then the default position for a liberal would be say, well, let's just remove it and build something new, right? Kind of thing. And I thought,
I'd go the other way and say that a lot of conservatives are saying, let's remove this obstruction to the market economy so it'll work better. Why have you got that silly regulation there? That's obviously, if we remove that regulation, things will work much better. I've had plenty of experience with, pardon the French, shithouse bureaucrats and shithouse bureaucratic rules. So I well and truly know the experience. But at the same time, some regulations actually have a creative force on society, and that the default position they shouldn't be there is one of the reasons conservatives stuff up. Like we've had 40 years now of what's called neoliberal. Now, that's actually arch conservative in the sense of saying we should make the world look like an economics first-year textbook. Okay?
Yeah.
As if that's an actual description of how the world works. It's not anything but. It's a caricature of the real world. Now, when you do that, you end up having a system which the conservative will say this is the wonderful system we've designed, and all these disastrous things that are happening were unintended consequences. They were the predictable consequence of imposing a fictional fantasy model on the real world. So that's I'd reverse your analogy there. To say, well, if it's there, there must be some sort of reason for it. Let's not knock it over in haste. That's more the progressive position. The conservative, that shouldn't be there. Let's get rid of it. Things will work better. And then suddenly, whatever it was stopping happening happens. Like you take off the guide fins on a boat, and it goes faster until it tips over when a wave hits it. And there's a certain degree of lack of respect for existing institutions in what so-called modern conservatives put forward. But if you go back to the conservatives of the 19th century, they were all for preserving existing rules, not overthrowing them. So ironically, conservative today means somebody who wants to overthrow existing rules. That's the opposite of what conservative meant in the 19th and 18th centuries.
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot lately about the incompatibility of labor governments to kind of step away or step into that third form of government. I guess, a government or a party that represents labor. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on it being antithetical with a climate change solution. And maybe I'll clarify just with one further sort of elaboration. And it's built on the fact that, or it's built on the sentiment that somebody like Yuval Noah Harari, a historian, from Israel, has said that we are going to see more and more of a useless class. That means redundant people that are not necessary in the economies in terms of labor, right? And this could be because of mechanized technology and this type of thing. That might be kind of erroneous in thinking that way, right? There's probably always something for people to do. But I mean, the idea that I came up with, and that was the reason for this particular series, was that does it make economic sense for people to stay home, right? As opposed to trying to participate in an economy that produces ridiculous, redundant materials or production, right? All increasing GDP, and this is kind of a secular sort of sickness. Anyways, I'm wondering what you thought about that.
Well, my perspective always ends up being a rather long-term one, and that is that we can't sustain growth of the economy on a finite planet. That's what was said by Malthus 2 centuries ago. Was said by the limits to growth half a century ago. It was disparaged and poo-pooed by mainstream economists who made the term Malthusian and limits to growth disparaging terms. It's bloody mathematical engineering entropy reality that can't continue forever. So if we do survive climate change, then ultimately human civilization will do most of its production in outer space, whether that's orbiting the planet, meteor mining, et cetera, et cetera. If you want to continue, if you want to experience the continuation of the growth in per capita consumption that we've experienced for the last 200 years, then in the next 200 years it has to start happening off planet. Now, when that happens, you can't have a job in outer space you commute to on a 9-to-5 basis. So the whole foundation of the power of the working class to get some of the share of the free energy we're turning into commodities on the planet right now has come out of the fact that you can't make those commodities without labor. Now, at some point, that's just going to be virtually untrue. There'll be a trivial proportion of labor necessary to make that stuff in outer space factories. And the people back on the planet, if you don't find another way of getting income to them, you're going to end up in the Hunger Games. So you have to have a way that says that you should not be going to work. In fact, you can't be going to work because the work simply doesn't exist on this planet, and it can't exist for energy, entropy, polluting the biosphere type reasons.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I did approach, I've kind of moved on because I approached another economist, and I was really interested because in his CV he said that he works with or works on like a steady state equilibrium, and I know that's kind of like I think that's a lot of rubbish, right? But I mean, especially in the neoclassical sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, on that point, like if we're adding anything at all to the carbon dioxide level of the planet, if we're adding anything at all in terms of exploiting energy and dumping waste energy in any form into the biosphere, ultimately that's unsustainable.
Yeah, no, I agree. But it was interesting. I approached him, and the single answer was, I'm not an expert in that. I didn't try and bait him or try and feel like he was ambushed. I just said, let's have a conversation. Everything that I do, when people look at my stuff, it's very much like this. I don't really bring panels and try and instigate a fight or, put somebody. So it was just interesting, as I'm not an expert on that. I thought, well, you are an expert on your published papers about equilibrium, and that would be an interesting conversation to have. I'm sure Steve could be very, civil in this sort of regard, but, because he's not an expert in post-Keynesian economics, he refuses to come and be a part of that conversation. And I find that maybe I'm coming into the world of Steve Keen a little bit to say, why? Like, what's going on here?
Yeah, there isn't a debate in economics, okay? And this is like from the outside, you'd think, well, there's you get people like with my views, you get Austrian perspectives, you get Marxist, you get neoclassical, and you'd think they're all debating with each other avidly. In fact, they're ignoring each other. If you drew a diagram of who reads what, then you'd find that, generally speaking, Marxists read Marxists, Austrians read Austrians, neoclassicals read neoclassicals, and post-Keynesians read neoclassicals and post-Keynesians, because we're the only ones who are trying to have a debate with the mainstream. But generally speaking, people, it's exactly the same as religion. How many Catholics know what Buddhists think? And it's just that so the debate should be there, because you've got, obviously radically different perspectives about how the economy operates. And we've got to just be having religion. We've always got a supreme being somewhere. I think I've been told there's one or two religions that don't actually have a supreme being. God knows which ones. God knows which ones. That's a good one. But generally speaking, people in religion stick to their own belief system, and they communicate about it. They find ways of promoting it. No way do they debate their belief system with somebody else, because if you can't debate a belief in a fundamental way. And the same thing applies in economics. There are such core beliefs at the bottom of each of those schools of thought, except, I have to say, the Post-Keynesian, which really came out of frustration at the other lot, saying, for Christ's sake, throw this bloody ideology out the window. How does a fucking capitalist system actually work? Now, that's pretty much the core religion of Post-Keynesians. They've got some big mistakes in what they've done. They've got stuck with bad mathematics. They've used difference equations rather than differential equations and complex systems, just because that's the math they learned from neoclassicals when they went through. But generally speaking, there's a degree of realism. The guiding principle of the Post-Keynesian school in general is, how does this thing actually work? Not this system, is the best possible system because it works this way, which is Austrian and neoclassical, or this is the worst possible system because it's going to collapse into socialism, which is the Marxist one. But generally speaking, there's almost no debate. So I'm not at all amazed that guy didn't want to engage.
Yeah, it's really, really bizarre. I want to spend a little bit more time on the labor issue, because I'm really concerned about it, and it makes me ponder and makes me think a lot about the the constriction of the economies in a more austere, I think sensibly. I don't think we can spend our way out of climate change. Are you in the same kind of mindset?
We have to ration our way out of climate change.
Yeah.
And like I've seen recently, I've got to still read the paper, but I saw a paper from some people I have some respect for, which came out at saying the energy, and this isn't just coal-fired stuff, this is everything. Energy consumption of the average American has to drop by a factor of 10 before you have a sustainable load on the planet. Now that doesn't mean the poorest American has to consume 1/10 as much. It means the average consumption has to fall back to about the level of the 1960s or 70s. But it's mainly the wealthy who would be bringing that down, rather than the people at the bottom whose incomes haven't risen much since the 1970s. So, it's rationing. We have drastically overstepped, and we have to ration on one hand while putting as many resources as we can into building means to have energy systems that don't hit us with carbon initially, but a whole range of other restrictions have to apply as well. So we can't spend our way. We have to ration our way up.
Okay, so you hold with me just for a little bit more, because I'm going against you on this one. Okay, it's just an idea, but you rightfully are pointing out that the people in our society that have the ability to have less, right? Because the poor don't have the ability to do an order of magnitude less based, of their spending and their consumption habits and this type of thing, right? Mm-hmm. Where I'm going with this is to say the labor class should be, now the terminology might be a little bit off. They should be paid to stay at home, basically, right? Now, this is a matter of incentive. So the thought experiment really has to do it with incentive. When you take from people, they don't like that, right? But if we incentivize to move a mass of labor to say, yeah, you know what? You guys have early retirement, stay at home. You don't need to go to work. Basically, you have this sort of, wow, what an incentive that would be. A labor party.
That's right? Partly why I come with the idea of carbon rationing.
Okay, go on.
Because you have a universal carbon credit. Everybody gets paid a universal carbon credit. And per capita equal to for everybody in society. You could start it at the average of the country quite happily, and therefore 95% of people would would be able to sell excess credits to the 5% who exhaust it and make up 50% of consumption of carbon. And that would be an income redistribution scheme from the wealthy to the poor, which would be for the, quite possibly for the poorest, would be a good reason not to have to worry about working anymore, because you just sell your universal carbon credits, some of them for money, and then with the combination of money and universal carbon credits, you could buy whatever you needed.
Yeah, I think
needed, not wanted, by the way.
Steve, that's brilliant. It really is. And I want to tell you that I actually had the very similar type of thought. It wasn't framed around a universal carbon credit, which I think is brilliant. But it was, I basically thought it would be, the average income should be kind of, spread amongst everybody. But this is actually better. It's focused around a universal carbon credit. I love that idea. That's really brilliant. And then the idea about the universal carbon credit is that if that entry level worker, right? There's lots of it. They say, well, look, I don't want to do that anymore. I don't need to go and do that. I don't need to take a low paying job cleaning somebody's toilets, right? Basically, screw that. I'll stay home and tend to my family and raise my children and all these kinds of things. So this is like, well, where are we going to get people to do that kind of stuff? And I'm thinking, well, hey, maybe they'll have to do it. Maybe there's other, you know what I mean? Like it'll have this unintended consequence of realizing that there's a section of our society that doesn't have to be treated like slaves. You know what I mean? And so that's I think an unintended byproduct that arguably could actually make our society more cohesive. And, I don't see how it would make it abrasive. I don't think people are going to revolt in the street because they have to do menial tasks or, cut people's lawns or, tend to guard, these kinds of things, right? Like what are the other sorts of things that the lower level workers are usually doing?
Yeah, well, it's more a case of I want to reduce the amount of people traveling in private jets, for example. That's more where that's where you get 20 and 30 times the carbon consumption of even the average commercial jet passenger, let alone the average person. So we have to do something which is going to drastically reduce that side of the consumption we're currently doing, and quite possibly if we really, what we're seeing in Canada and Northern America right now, those crazy temperatures, which are only the beginning of how bad they're going to get, and the instability, that's the real major point. Once you break down the firm patterns that have existed in terms of air circulation systems, and you suddenly have the possibility of polar air and tropical air going over the same region of the temperate zone in a matter of weeks, then your agriculture system collapses. And then what you can produce in terms of food to satisfy people will have to be rationed. And the amount of extraneous garbage people are involved in producing, which they're doing because they have to go to work to get that job, to pay for their bills, that would also disappear. So you'd have to find some way to provide income to those people at the time, and that's where a universal carbon credit could come in, which would be something they could use as a trading capability with the wealthy who are still there, and the wealthy would find that those private jet costs are not not 4 times what it is for a flying business, but 40 times what it is for flying business, and those private planes would be retired. Equally, a lot of the mansions people currently live in would have to become share accommodation.
Brilliant.
We've got so much wasted, so much wasted ostentatious consumption, what Veblen used to call conspicuous consumption, and that has to go by the wayside if we're going to reduce our energy consumption sufficiently to be able to reverse the temperature increase we've caused, not just slow it down, but reverse it.
So just so I'm clear, the universal carbon credit is like a living wage that's equivalent to like an average American, average Canadians.
It's something which I want to I want to see central bank digital currencies get developed, which would be a way you could distribute these. A central bank digital currency could be used to distribute anything, any token you like, including the current national currency. But if it's there, then we could distribute universal carbon credits from it. We could require that anything sold through a supermarket had to have its carbon content deducted as well as its price when it was sold. Okay, and then that way you would have a means to ration, effectively become a form of ration card. Now that would be set, like the easy thing would be to start it at the average for a country, which would mean, as I said, 90 to 95% of people would find themselves with more than they needed for their normal monetary consumption levels. But it's also the sort of thing when you realise this is serious. Okay, it's either this or we die. Which do you prefer? And that was again the Second World War situation, particularly for the UK, of course, rationing when they were under the Blitz, rationing for everything. This would be, you could then say we're going to be reducing that by half now, quite possibly, when it became obvious we had to so drastically reduce energy consumption. So there's a whole range of ways it can be used, but the initial idea is we need it there because we're not going to avoid catastrophic breakdown. We're not going to avoid it. We're going to experience it and then have to realize what the hell do we do to get out of it. And if we don't have structures in place before it gets there, then there may just be a complete breakdown anyway, and that's what I'm afraid of. That's why I want to see these things developed now.
Makes me sick to my stomach because I think there's portions and sections of our society that understand that, and people that just it doesn't compute. And in Alberta, we have this. This is where I was born, raised. Was in Alberta. I call it the tiny Texas of North America, okay. and it's it's oil rich and this type of thing. Well, in the native history, they have something called the head smashed in buffalo jump, and the native populations.
The head smashed in buffalo jump.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty cool.
Okay, yeah, it's a head smashed in buffalo jump. So what the natives would do is drive the herds of the buffalo towards this cliff, right?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And then they would, some of them could turn but a lot of them would fall off, and then the natives would go down to the pile of buffalo, and it's easy hunting, right? I mean,
yeah.
And I feel like a buffalo. I feel like a buffalo running in this herd going, I know there's a drop off over there. I don't want to run that way, but I feel us just like pounding towards this cliff. And I don't know what to do other than part of what we're doing is we're doing it here today. We're talking about it, right? And I'm going to be open to ideas on air, off air, whatever. I mean, you're doing, I think, as much as you can, but it's like, oh my goodness, like what, it's.
Yeah. I mean, that's the scary thing. I mean, I'm doing what this is, I think, been the story of humanity throughout its existence, because there would have been people like me raising warnings about depletion of resources in Teotihuacan, for example. I'm not going to use Easter Island because I'm seeing a lot of disputes about Easter Island actually being more a case of colonial wipeout of the resources than the natives doing it to themselves. But places like Teotihuacan in Mexico, we know it fell apart under its own momentum, and it may well be that it was a case of depleting the resources to the stage where the soil wasn't productive anymore, and all the stupid rituals that the wealthy were doing about executing captives from local other tribes to make the soil grow weren't working. So ultimately, the commoners go and burn down the buildings of the wealthy. So yeah, a lot of the people realize you guys are leading us into catastrophe. Your human sacrifices do bugger all, and equally, let's be looking at the people in charge now. And like coming from Australia, of course, I'm watching the politicians down there responding to the pandemic by saying we need a natural gas-led recovery. What load of crap is that? But that's what happens. You got people like Matthias Cormann becoming head of the OECD. You couldn't get a less appropriate person for that particular organization at this particular time. But that's the sort of person we put in charge. So because people's power comes from riding the current ideology, when that ideology leads you to a calamity, you've got idiots committed to an unsustainable system who are the ones in charge of where you're headed.
And that's really what it is. It's turned into a malignant ideology, and we can look at that and label the current economic system a ideology. I don't know if we would correctly say that that's neoclassic economics, as well as I'm not really against capitalism per se. I think there's nothing wrong with capitalism, but from your standpoint, the malignant part of the ideology at play is really an out of touch, out of sync economic system, along with corrupt and tyranny of the majority, of basically following an ideology that's just politically incorrect as well.
Yeah, and the pity is that, and I've got used to this over the decades. Most people aren't interested in this stuff. Like my wife is a perfect foil for me on that front. She has no interest in economics, no interest in climate change, et cetera, et cetera. She has a great interest in living life now. And you can't blame people for that. We shouldn't have to worry about this stuff. Okay, that is the sort of stuff you should be able to leave to your leaders. But back to the question about the state of democracy, we've got people who are leading us into this, and if the trust that everybody tends to have in political leadership is what's setting us up for the catastrophe we're going to have, when that trust will collapse. And then you're going to face sort of, the French Revolution type situation. And out of that chaos, we're going to try to, snatch a continuation of human civilization. I think the odds are not particularly good of being successful.
I don't know if it's an apt comparison to the French Revolution, only because I don't see a revolution happening. Right? I don't see a switch in power. I don't see. Unless we strip down, reverse the, and switch the power structure. Is that fair?
Yeah, it depends on just how bad the breakdowns are. I mean, for example, if you look at what's happening with the climate right now in America, and I saw on Twitter this day a wheat fire in, I think it's in Alberta actually. So a whole wheat section of wheat on a very, very dramatic fire. So if you have a collapse of food systems, then depending on how regional they are, then you're going to be forced to do things which you've never done before, and that's where I think we're going to see the military turning up inevitably, because if we do get a collapse in 2 or 3 bread baskets around the world at the same time, which is quite feasible with the instability we're facing, then you're going to be unable to supply people. You're going to see this is what the Arab Spring was about to a large degree, apparently. Dramatic increase in oil cost and dramatic increase in food costs, with food availability collapsing and the price of the food rising till it's out of reach of the poor, and then riots. And because they didn't actually end up all that well. You've got a more reactionary government in most of those countries now than you had beforehand. But you did have that sort of, from the bottom up breakdown when people start starving.
Yeah. Wow. Just, it's generational though, that we don't have that in our memory, not in my lifetime, not in my parents' lifetime. I feel so privileged and civilized. And I mean that just in a sense of our society lives in this this civilized decadence, right?
Yeah, that's a good expression. Yeah, yeah. I mean, like the amount of energy we consume. I mean, I wouldn't be able to have this conversation without the air conditioning going in the room I'm in, because the temperature here would be 50 degrees Celsius. So, and I do think about the air conditioning because this is part of my training. But the fact that you can simply buy a machine, which means that a room which would be 50 degrees Celsius and unlivable is 25, even though it's set on 18, it's still livable, is something we do well. And we don't even realize that the amount of energy we're getting here to make our lives comfortable would have taken a retinue of support of sycophants and lackeys for the king or the queen of the country 200 years earlier. So we've just, because we've traveled the energy trajectory of the average person for the last 2 centuries, we don't realize how far removed we are from what was average 2 centuries earlier.
Yeah.
So it is. No, it's civilized decadence. It's a good expression.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. So then the next point that I'm going to make is it's about population, and it, it may end in something that's just purely rhetorical. It's a really odd one to try and comment on, but you mentioned earlier about the like 1/10, so like an order of magnitude less in terms of consumption, and there was a fellow by the name of Thanos. He's a mythical figure in character in the Marvel movies, and he snapped his finger and then eliminated half of the population in the entire world. So one of the things that would happen if there was, it sounds morbid and it's really horrific actually, but if there was such a like a mass starvation across the planet, and we look at the next 100 years and we go from 8.9 billion to 1/10 of that, right? What would you say that would, like, what would that reality be like? I mean, it reminds me of I think it's David Wallace Wells, I think, or he wrote a book about the climate, and it was a scary book. I don't know if that was the person that wrote it, but
that's the guy. I think Wallace Wells, yeah,
Wallace Wells, definitely. And he's saying that the potential that's coming is like 10 times more than the Holocaust. And this isn't meant to be alarmist. It's kind of like, guys, this is kind of what's happening now. Even amongst climate circles, he kind of gets, that it's like, well, but if we're talking about 8.9 billion people on the planet, and this gets reduced by, to 1/10 of that, this may force us back to not the 60s. This may force us back to like small tribal groups like, not the idea that you have communities and you do this because you want to feel good. It's like, this is survival of like, how does the community force itself to actually come together and help its neighbors?
Yeah, and those are the sorts of potential outcomes we face that it's hard to discuss in any circles right now, because you will get attacked by saying you're being alarmist by those who are climate denialists, but you'll also get attacked by saying you're alarmist for those who are trying to avoid that situation. So let's do it in a measured way. And I think, I find it a very difficult situation to be in, because I can appreciate the psychology of both perspectives. But yeah, we have to say, look, if we continue on this trajectory we're currently on, then we will have a complete breakdown in our food and our manufacturing systems. And in that situation, it'll be like the Mad Max type future is quite feasible.
So if we move away from extrapolating too far into the future, let me say, would your economist mindset say to you, or basically say to everybody, look, we can only deal with what's in front of us. So first of all, let's put a more realistic economic model in place, which you're proposing. And we put this in place and we'll deal with what comes in front of us one step at a time, corporations do it. It's quarterly. What are we going to do next quarter, the quarter after that? How are we going to adapt? And, what are this is really all we can do. I would imagine. Would that be kind of the more sensible approach?
It would have been 50 years ago.
Oh, I see. Okay.
My problem is the timing. And that's why I'm so angry at mainstream economists, particularly William Nordhaus and Richard Toll and all that crowd, because they have encouraged delay on the belief you can delay for 2 or 3 centuries. Now, their work is so naive, so badly put together, that what they see happening in centuries is probably going to happen in decades. And if we'd started working towards it 50 years ago, we could have done it in a fairly rational, reduce our load on the planet, don't let population get too high. Population's risen, pretty much doubled since the limits to growth came out. We're talking, what was that, 50 years ago? Well, doubling rate, it may even be, population is possibly 3 times what it was back then. Now, they were saying we should be limiting population from that point, from 1975. We try and have less than one replacement should have been the target in 1975. Well, that was the case. There'd now be 2 billion of humans, not virtually 9 billion humans. So if you're now trying to get back to that level from where you've got 9 billion and from where you've got the inequality we have as well, so 7 billion of those are not going to like any suggestion they should be consuming less because they've barely got to the stage of a decent consumption now.
This was a very interesting thing. There's a term in philosophy about that refers to anti-natalism, and so it's like this idea that you wouldn't know if you were never born, right? And I think there's some. I always think that there's a simple logic to that, right? And it kind of spins some people in circles sometimes, but basically. You're right. There's 8.9 billion people, and if you had 6 billion people that just never knew the difference because they were never born, then society wouldn't know any different. It just
it would be an utterly different world, and
it would be
which is quite sustainable and could do. You could have a gradual. If you need to go lower, you could do it in a gradual way. But it's too late for gradual. And that's what scares me. We have people who don't think there's any problem at all who are in charge. So you put those two together, and I can see a serious breakdown. And in that sense, I started reading a bit of David Wallace Wells' book, and I didn't particularly like how it was written. It was, the book I've most enjoyed on that front, because I've still got complaints about, by Mark Linas, called 6 Degrees, and that does a much better job of saying, okay, what are the what are the likely social and economic impacts of anywhere between a 1 and 6 degree increase in global temperature? And he's done a very, very good job of distilling what you can find in science papers out of each of those levels, the paleontology playing a major role, of course. What would the climate be like at 1, 2, 3 globally change? What would that do in different parts of the world? But he hasn't referenced it the way that I can follow up the articles. So that annoys me. But in terms of an overall view of what's feasible, then I think that's probably the best book around.
Okay. All right. Yeah, the listeners will definitely appreciate that. And anything else that you're reading right now? Other than trying to focus on your paper. Subtle hit there.
I hate it. I've got to read all this neoclassical garbage. Like I'm deconstructing. I'm trying to write a simplified version of DICE, Nordhaus's DICE model, just so that I can give it to physicists and say this is the current parameters of the model, and this is why it's so utterly stupid to use this for any form of long-term thinking, let alone something about climate change. And I just think, why can't I be writing something sensible, rather than reading this garbage? And that's partly the whole hassle. We've got an elite in charge that doesn't know what it's talking about and lives in a mythical world. Back to the the Democrat versus Republican stuff we were talking about earlier. So I wish I was reading something enjoyable, but it's really hard to slog for this stuff because you just basically, you want to pull your hair out as you read it. It's so bad and it's so glib at the same time.
Hmm. So tell me a little bit more about the physicist, because this is I'm guessing that this is integral about how you're actually writing the paper, because you're building a mathematical proof, and you want to present the paper in a way that is offers that proof. Is that kind of the idea?
That's part of it. I mean, anyway, again, one of the hassles of spending my 50 years of my life attacking neoclassical economics means my mathematics has gone backwards. Okay, I can't do mathematical what I could do 40 years ago because I've spent so much time pulling apart garbage by then. But one little thing we want to do, the one thing the neoclassicals do is presume that the current relationship between income and temperature across the globe can be used to predict what's going to happen with climate change. So I've used, yeah, I know. Like this, for example, they are, and I've got this as one of Richard Toll's tweets, that Maryland and Alaska, I think, have got similar income levels, and Iowa and Florida have similar income levels, and they differ by 10 degrees Celsius in temperature levels. So climate is not a major determinant of income. Oh, this is the garbage that they're using the current, income and temperature data, the United States, to say that a 10-degree temperature difference won't have much impact because Maryland is 10 degrees colder than Florida. So if Maryland's temperature increases by 10 degrees, its income will fall to Florida's, which is a 20% fall. So what are you worried about? I mean, quite literally, that's the sort of nonsense that they're putting is the so-called empirical data. Now, to pull that apart, if you look at if you try to imagine a distribution of temperature versus GDP, then you get a three-dimensional normal distribution. Mm-hmm. In a sense, okay. There's some ideal there's an ideal temperature level, an ideal GDP, and you've got a distribution around that. Well, they're saying, okay, you can sample that, and that's going to tell you what happens when you move the temperature distribution 4 degrees to 10 degrees to the north. Okay, so mm-hmm. the average goes from 13 to 23, and they're saying, well, you can predict what's going to happen to that by sampling a 10 degree in the current distribution. No, you effing can't. But what I want to do is, well, can we do a mathematical proof of that? So one of my mathematical colleagues have set that as a task for him. I hope he'll pull that off in the next couple of weeks. But the basic idea, there's a bit of a joke in physics. If you look for jokes about physicists, you'll see one of the jokes starts up by saying, assume a spherical cow.
Right, the spherical cow, yes.
Okay. Now, the way to go about that is we'll assume there's a linear relationship between GDP, between location on the planet and temperature. So you go from, and you forget about the bottom half because it's a sphere, so you work on the top half. Okay, so from 0 to 90 degrees north, that's your range. And then you have a temperature distribution which goes from, say, plus 30 to minus 30 along that line. And then you have an income distribution which peaks at 15. So you draw a parabola, okay, where there's peak at 15 and it falls to much lower at plus 30 and, of course, far, far lower at minus 30. That's your overall shape. And then you say, well, now we're going to go to a new distribution of income where you go not from plus 30 to minus 30, but from plus 35 to minus 25. Okay. And that's putting it simply because it may well be the minuses disappear from the planet. When we look back at I've forgotten the actual epoch where this applied, but when there was only one a circulation system in the northern hemisphere, the average temperature of the Arctic was 22 degrees Celsius. So, wow. Okay, so the zeros might, but you draw a new distribution from plus 35 to minus 25, and then you have your income distribution, which still peaks at 15, okay, but is now falling off much more radically in the high temperatures. Can you do that in a stylized sort of way to say what you draw out of one sample will be nothing like what you find in the other sample? Now, that's what we have to do because they are simply assuming that they can use the current climate as climate and income distribution pattern as an analogy for climate change. No, you can't.
You're trying to prove that you can't, and that's the idea. You're trying to put the proof that you can't. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Wow, that's fascinating. Well, I mean, Yeah. But it's like you're proving
what should be bleeding obvious.
Yeah, you're proving it's something that
bleeding fucking obvious. That's the trouble. And this is why I say it's like a religious wars rather than intellectual ones, because when you look at the data, it's obvious you can't do that, because climate change involves an enormous increase in retained energy, which will completely change the entire climate and may well drive us out of existence at 10 degrees Celsius, 10 degrees Kelvin. That'd be like there would be. I've seen studies saying a 5.5 degree increase in temperature would make 74% of the planet uninhabitable for humans. Now 10, you're left with about 5% of the planet we can actually inhabit. If you think it's going to have an economy in that 5%, you need your head. Well, I was going to say red, but there'd be other things you'd have done to your head in that situation. It's insane. But this is the sort of nonsense that underlies the mainstream writing on climate change. And that's why we're going to be, the people who'll be most surprised by what happens to the economy as temperature rises are economists.
Mm. Steve, I want to propose something here that you say you're not trying to propose a new economic theory. I think just go with me here. You say I'm trying to save economics, because in that same vein of we're not going to have an economy.
No, that's right.
Like we literally won't have an economy unless we do something drastic that's going that will describe the way that activity functions around people, right? And I'm using a very simplistic term of economics, right?
We won't have an economy if we let this happen. I mean, and this is the whole idea about the relationship between climate and human civilization. It is a very stable period of about 10,000 years with very little variation in the overall climate of the planet. That's when human civilization evolved. We've been around as a species for something of the order of 250,000 years, and only in 10,000 years have we developed human civilization. Now, that 10,000 years was after the last ice age, when temperatures were about 4 to 6 degrees Celsius below what they are now, across the entire, like in terms of a global average temperature. And when you look at the temperature data, it's a remarkable period of relative stability. The climate has gone up and down, as people have said. Climate change deniers who make this point all the time. It's risen and it's fallen. Yeah, well, it's only when it was fairly slowly changing did human civilization come about. And that probably is because with the slow rate of change, you could stay in the same region and turn hunting and gathering into farming. Now, if you have a rapidly changing, and that rapidly means what it normally does, okay, without our intervention, without our carbon dioxide, then with that normal up and down of the climate, we never got enough stability to have established settlements that it can enable the accumulation of knowledge we've got over time, and that expressing that knowledge in technology that enables us to use more energy than other species and therefore get to the dominant position we have on the planet. So the realistic economics would have said right from the very outset, we've been very lucky this 10,000 years. Let's make sure we don't move outside this envelope. So now it's our responsibility to maintain the climate of the planet in the state we found it during the Holocene.
Yeah.
Instead, they're saying, who needs the Holocene? Yeah, we've handled changes in temperature. No, we bloody haven't. We only evolved during the stable period. And you guys enjoyed the stability like nothing, like literally nothing on Earth.
Yeah, and my personal view on the geoengineering is that, look, just don't rely on any geoengineering. Fix this.
We've been doing geoengineering for the last 5,000 years. Okay. Okay. We have changed the climate more than any other species. Dinosaurs set their own climate. There's a major reason why there were those giant animals. They trampled the land between the forests, et cetera, et cetera. So life always, we're breathing oxygen because of cyanobacteria. Okay, the climate of the planet was, the atmosphere was 90% carbon dioxide until about 700 million years ago. So life affects the environment of life. always has, always will. But we're causing a rate of change in that faster than any species in history.
Yeah.
And by history, I mean paleontology. So, and the thing is, so we have been doing it, and we have to do it more responsibly.
Yeah. Here. I think that's a pretty good summary to almost an hour of exhaustible talk. How about you? You're good on that?
That'll do me.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
All right, sir. That's another wrap. I really appreciate it. And until next week, thanks everybody. And that's Mr. Steve Keen. Stay tuned for another episode next week. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Steve.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.